Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mintcast, an interview series featuring dissenting voices the establishment would rather silence. I'm your host, Manar Adli, founder and editor-in-chief of Mint Press News. Now, to help us continue these interviews, we invite you to become a member of our Patreon, which we will link to the video below. And as an independent watchdog media outlet that exposes the corruption of the ruling class and the ongoing attacks on our civil liberties, we are facing major censorship and shadow banning by social media tech giants. And that's why we asked you to share our videos, okay? So today we're joined by Vanessa Beeley, an independent investigative journalist and war correspondent based in Damascus, Syria, to help us get up to speed with the war in Syria that was once the focus of mainstream coverage as it pushed a humanitarian interventionist narrative. Vanessa, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Minora. It's great to be back on with you.
So you recently published an analysis with RT looking at what's taking place in the city of Daraa, which has been referred to within the mainstream corporate media as the cradle of the Syrian revolution. But today it actually has been liberated by the Syrian army. But as you have, and Mint Press has reported nearly a decade ago, Daraa was actually the touch paper lit by hardline Libyan mercenaries imported into Syria prior to the revolution that took place the uprising in 2011. Now, these mercenaries, as we reported and you have been reporting, have literally been trained and armed to the T by the CIA, by MI6, alongside Saudi intelligence. So, talk to us about what's taking place in Daraa today and give us a little bit of a history of Daraa and how it's symbolic to the entire peace process that's taking place inside Syria, that's basically seeing more alliances between these armed groups with the Syrian government.
Yeah, I mean, Daraa, as you rightly say, was described by Western media at the height of its fervor to topple the Syrian government as the cradle of in inverted commas, the revolution. As you rightly say, of course, that so-called revolution was very much power multiplied by Libyan mercenaries, Libyan weapons that had been funneled into Syria prior to 2011 in preparation for this CIA MI6 engineered coup d'etat. And actually, I've just finished a 75-year timeline of CIA interventions and interference alongside MI6 in Syria. So even going back to 1946, I started in. The CIA has run black ops in Syria to topple various successive Syrian governments, particularly those, of course, that don't comply with American neo-colonialist policy or that threaten Israeli Zionist security in the region. So in a sense, this 2011 10-year war is nothing new. It's just another CIA intervention that has been a lot more protracted, a lot more bloody. It has, of course, involved multiple nations vying for influence and power over Syria, because Syria is effectively the economic hub of the Middle East, and then sort of radiating out into further global circles, let's say. And that's why influence over Syria is so important. And Daraa, as I explained in the article, is really at the center of that entire vortex. Why? Because the pipeline that is now being discussed, which will run from Egypt through Jordan, through Syria and into Lebanon, runs directly through the southern territories of Daraa, which explains why Daraa and, let's say, the other resource-rich areas were the primary target for the US coalition proxies at the beginning of the regime change operations in 2011. So therefore, I wouldn't call it the liberation of Daraa. What I would call it, because Daraa really was liberated effectively from the armed groups in 2018, when Russia intervened to broker a peace deal. And Russia effectively at that point took the armed groups, the ones that were not bused to Idlib to fight alongside the more extremist groups like Al-Qaeda, for example. But the Syrian militants and mercenaries who stayed behind in Daraa were brought under Russian control. However, that was largely unsuccessful because those armed groups, and actually in July 2018, I kind of by accident met one of the leaders of those armed groups who told me quite clearly that they would continue in their campaign to topple the Syrian government, that they were not going to, even though they had given up their heavy weapons, they had maintained control over their light weapons, and they were going to use them.
And so from that was Adham al-Karad, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
He was a commander of the engineering and missile division of the Free Syrian Army.
Yeah, and basically, he was responsible for manufacturing some of the most deadly weapons that were used against civilian targets and military targets during the occupation of areas of the city of Daraa by these armed groups. So effectively, between 2018 and 2021, chaos reigned in the sense that there was a large degree of gang warfare between the various militant groups. They were assassinating each other. But they were also carrying out large-scale assassinations of who they considered to be government loyalists. And these could be doctors, they could be teachers, they could be students. Anyone that came under that category was at risk of being assassinated. In fact, in those 3 years, they assassinated more than 2,000 people. And of those, I think it was 12 children among those. So fast forward to 2021, and effectively Damascus took the decision. And in my view, this decision was taken without discussion with Russia, which for me is a very important point, because this means that despite the assistance that Russia has given to Syria, and despite the Western media portrayal of Russian role as being another imperialist power interfering inside Syria, what this demonstrates is that Damascus has maintained its sovereignty. It's maintained the sovereignty of Syria. It is still taking decisions that benefit Syria and that are not necessarily in accordance with Russia's wishes. So effectively, Damascus sent military contingents into Daraa, not to attack, not to violently reclaim the area, but to effectively put pressure on the armed groups to come to the negotiations table. And on the 31st of August, the peace deal was finally signed, Syrian with Syrian. And at this point, I visited the areas. The wall that used to separate Daraa al-Balad, which was the hub of the armed group occupation, from the rest of the city was torn down. A number of major military checkpoints were dismantled and the soldiers were sent away. So, this was a very clear message from Damascus that, okay, we mean that we want to broker peace between Syrians without any kind of foreign intervention. We want to listen to you. We want to hear whatever grievances you have against the government. We are not going to arrest you. We're not going to punish you for having been in opposition to the government or even having taken up arms. And many of these armed groups committed terrible massacres, both of civilian and military targets. And when I visited, this is very indicative of what has gone on throughout Syria. And of course, it's something that is not reported in Western media. I saw effectively the 16th Division, which is under the direct control of the president of Syria, President Assad, negotiating and speaking to farmers and to civilians in areas of the countryside as they were combing those areas for weapons and inspecting farms. And what I noted very clearly was nobody was afraid of being photographed by me. Nobody was afraid to talk to me. People were able to speak freely to me about anything they wanted to talk to me about. And this is very much the nature of the whole peace processes across Syria. And something, as I said, that is totally ignored in Western media is that President Assad believes you have to break that cycle of, let's say, incentivized hate. But of course, many of these armed factions come from the Muslim Brotherhood sectors of society that have, since the 1940s, been weaponized against successive Syrian governments.
Right. And I think that this entire Muslim Brotherhood grouping of many of these rebel groups has played an integral role in pushing this sectarianism through the mainstream corporate media as well, narrative to justify intervention, to paint this as, Iran expanding its influence into Syria and into Lebanon and destabilizing the Middle East. And so we have to, in the West, partner up with the Gulf states and with Israel and with Turkey to arm and fund these Muslim Brotherhood groups so that, we can, defer Iran, right? The power structure. And so I want to talk about, I would like you to talk more about this pipeline that is being used to bring oil and gas from Egypt. Today, Lebanon is facing a major energy crisis, and most recently, Hezbollah was able to bring in, some, oil and gas from Iran, completely going against the sanctions. So, how does this pipeline play a role in the geopolitics of the region?
I mean, it's had a tremendous effect. As I said, the reason that Dara was occupied was to have control over this pipeline. And of course, when you also have to remember that Lebanon is currently under US occupation. The UK itself, according to recently leaked UK Foreign Office documents, has been infiltrating security structures and institutions, army, military. It's erected watchtowers on the Lebanese-Syrian border, which violates all kind of international law. It can't actually do that. It shouldn't be able to do that. And so Lebanon, has been really the center of another power struggle, if you like, which of course is in order to further punish Syria, to further control and to try and push back against the Iranian influence, as you said, in the region. So when Hezbollah negotiated the supply of fuel through Syria into Lebanon to ease the fuel and energy crisis in Lebanon, of course, the United States can't stand this because it doesn't want the Lebanese people to see Hezbollah, that is designated a terrorist organization by the US, as the savior of Lebanon. So at this point, and this was immediately also after the reclamation, as I call it, of Dara, the US ambassador, so not Joe Biden, the US ambassador agreed to partially lift sanctions on Syria, which demonstrates the hypocrisy of US sanctions. But, they can rapidly be lifted when America needs to, of course, not to actually save lives or to enable people to be fed or to receive medical care. But no, when America has need for fuel or energy or resources, it can partially lift the sanctions in order to allow the supply of gas and fuel from Egypt, as I said, through Jordan, through Syria, and into northern Lebanon to Tripoli. And there is a need, I think, to restore part of the pipeline, which I think is valued. The restoration cost is around 500 million from memory. And so, it's kind of, I guess in the US action, it's suggested that maybe the US will take some part in that actual restoration project. And of course, what this did then was to have a kind of domino effect. Once Dara was back under the protection of Damascus, and it reintegrated into Syria as a whole without any kind of foreign power intervention. Then we also started to see normalization of relations between Jordan and Syria. Jordan is opening up flights back to Damascus airport for the first time in 10 years. Syrian officials were involved in the meeting about the fuel pipeline. alongside Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon. And now we have the UAE also. President Assad spoke to them yesterday, I believe, again about normalizing relations and looking at investment into Syria. So effectively, for me, the data situation being resolved has kind of had a domino effect. And what we're actually seeing also in the media is this gritted teeth normalization of relations with Assad. You know, we're seeing in Newsweek, in The Guardian, in what was it, Foreign Policy. Even Charles Lister is kind of, I keep having this image of like,
do you want me to read the headlines that we have?
Yeah.
Collected a couple here. So Charles Lister, who's a senior fellow and director of the Syria and counterterrorism and extremism, programs at the Middle East Institute, which is literally funded by Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Right? He has been such a staunch, humanitarian interventionist. I mean, I believe he
created the 70,000 moderates, for heaven's sake.
Yeah, well, I was going to say he actually met with a lot of these rebels, right?
Well, yeah, he claimed. But I mean, he was the one who effectively set off the whole thing of there's 70,000 moderate rebels inside Syria, which was picked up by then Tory party Prime Minister David Cameron, and that whole kind of myth just underpinned the narratives for years.
Exacerbate, just how many of these rebels exist. Exactly. Well, his article in Foreign Policy, his title was "Biden's Inaction on Syria Risks Normalizing Assad and His Crimes." And then we have something from Newsweek here that, we were looking at. That headline reads, Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad, once a political pariah, is now being welcomed back by many of the countries that cut him off 10 years ago, despite ongoing U.S. opposition. So what you're saying is that we're seeing this kind of normalization taking place, and U.S. media is kind of, like you said, gritting with these headlines.
Yeah, because at the same time, of course, Egypt, who's involved in this energy coalition, also stepped up to kind of normalize relations with Turkey. Of course, the enmity between Turkey and Egypt was over Turkey's support for the Muslim Brotherhood. But part of that normalization deal is that Turkey withdraws from Syria. We then, of course, had the Assad-Putin summit where the language from Putin became very bellicose, very belligerent about US occupation and Turkish occupation of Syrian territory. Putin then had the meeting with Erdogan. The S-400s were off the table, and it was quite clear that Putin had said to Erdogan, okay, enough, like you need to withdraw from Syrian territory. And certainly since all of these events, we've seen an uptick in the actual attacks on Turkish troops inside Idlib, because people may not be aware, but alongside Al-Qaeda and various branches of Al-Qaeda are Turkish troops. I mean, I was recently at a border area with the front lines, the Idlib front lines in Jurin, and we came under attack with missiles from the mountain range that is adjacent to the village where we were. And we were told by Syrian military, Russian military, that basically there's a Turkish base only a few kilometers away from our position. And that base is providing surveillance for the terrorist groups in order that they can target us, basically. So Turkey is, a total belligerent in this conflict, alongside, of course, Erdogan's Ottoman Empire, neo-Ottoman Empire ambitions, and his support of Muslim Brotherhood. But of course, Turkey is also under tremendous pressure domestically, in the sense that there's now 5 million Syrian refugees on Turkish territory. The Turkish public is not happy about this. Now there's an influx of refugees from Afghanistan because Turkey militarily is interfering in Afghanistan post-US so-called withdrawal.
It almost backfired their strategy in Syria, because whenever there's an influx of refugees into a country, that can really put an economic strain on that country.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the refugees have also been weaponized by Erdogan,
Right,
to
right.
blackmail the EU,
Absolutely.
and also to provide potential radicalization cells that can then be kind of recycled back into Syria or into Iraq to carry out terrorist attacks. Um, and of course, the US itself is kind of percolating terrorist groups. It's moving ISIS, which is, another proxy of the United States coalition. It's moving it around the northeast into the Badia, into the desert east of Palmyra and Homs to carry out isolated attacks against Syrian Arab army, and of course against fuel depots, against ammunition depots, as it did not so long ago. It attacked a fuel depot, and of course the US is occupying Syrian resources, not only oil, but it's also stealing wheat, barley, via its Kurdish Contras that are stealing these resources and then trading them outside of Syria.
Well, and I want to talk about that next because, the United States is weaponizing the terror groups that it claims to be fighting, especially in the northeast side of Syria. The United States is actively arming and funding the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF. Many of them are Kurdish forces. And supposedly they're fighting ISIS, but in reality, the United States is using this group to occupy some of Syria's, largest oil reserves, and Syria's access to things like water that's necessary to keep, the country quenched. And so I think I was reading this morning that the Biden administration, while there's a mass military pullout out of Afghanistan, which we all know that the CIA and intelligence is still operating in Afghanistan, that the United States is going to continue to keep its boots on the ground in Syria, and that make up about, I would say, I think I read, I don't remember exactly, but I think I read it was 900 U.S. troops on the ground.
It's more than that, but yeah,
I was
that
going to
might
say
be what they're saying.
It's probably more than that. I mean, you have to assume that it's more than that, right?
Yeah. I think you have to assume that any US administration is lying probably 90% of the time. And if you work on that basis, you can usually figure out what's going on.
We can't trust what they're saying about their motives and their agenda in that region, because we know that when the SDF occupied this area with the backing of the United States, the northeast of Syria, Arab Syrians were basically ethnically cleansed from this area, and the United States actually used white phosphorus. They used chemical weapons on civilians in this area in its fight against ISIS. So talk to us about what's happening in the northeast of Syria with the SDF and the US occupation there.
Well, effectively, as I said, the US, as you rightly said, is using ISIS as another proxy. I mean, this isn't something new. John Kerry in 2016 admitted this pretty much in a closed session in the UN, which has been documented. I think it was by the New York Times, actually, released the recordings or the transcript of that discussion. So the US is effectively using ISIS as what the RAND paper calls for swarming exercises. So for isolated attacks, as I said, but they're moving ISIS around. Even helicopters are coming in and picking up ISIS, taking them to Iraq. And of course, we can't forget that ISIS has taken responsibility for the attacks on Iraqi electrical power stations. So this is all part of the campaign to bring these countries to their knees, to deprive them of resources, to deprive them of energy, to deprive them of warmth in the winter, of air conditioning in the summer, to make their lives as miserable as possible, basically. And so ISIS has been re-infiltrated, if you like, into, as I said, the Badia area, the desert to the east of Palmyra and Homs, which is a vast area. And from there, they are basically working underground. They're laying IEDs in the main road from Deir ez-Zor, for example, down to Homs and Damascus. So they're targeting fuel convoys, military convoys, civilian convoys. and the ISIS holding camp, the biggest one, Al Hol, which is in the northeast. The UK is now paying to expand this camp, so to bring even more ISIS fighters into this area. And of course, we know what happens when you have terrorist groups inside a large holding camp. You have breakouts, right? And so this, in my view, this is a kind of a way to blackmail Damascus, and also to, as I said, to percolate these terrorist fighters from Iraq to Syria. And we know also that the US has been retraining ISIS fighters and re-equipping them in Iraq before bringing them back into Syria. In the same way, they're doing this in the Al Tanf base, which is on the border with Jordan. There they are recruiting ISIS fighters, arming them, equipping them. They're allowing terrorist groups to run military training exercises in the territory surrounding Al Tanf. There is a 55-kilometer exclusion zone, so Russian and Syrian military can't enter that zone around the Tanf area. Rukban refugee camp, which is close to Al Tanf, which they use constantly as another humanitarian narrative against the Syrian government, that's actually under the control of the US. It's another recruitment center for armed groups, and it's receiving weapons and equipment from Jordan into the camp. So, the US is heavily embedded in the Northeast, and it's going to be hard to prize its presence out of Syria in those areas. The other thing, of course, is that Israel has recently, in the last two attacks, it started to use Tanef as a launch base, as a launch pad for its attacks on the eastern desert area, the east of Palmyra and Homs. And what that led us to, of course, was yesterday, the terrorist attack in Damascus, where bombs were placed. We think bombs were placed on the underneath of a bus that was taking 14 civilians. Of course, it's been reported in Western media as being military, but actually they were civilians that were working in military institutions. 14 civilians were killed at around 5 a.m. in the morning. Now, if this had been 1 hour later, this is probably the busiest intersection in Damascus, President Bridge. It's where everyone comes to catch their bus or to catch their car or to pick up the service, the little kind of vans that carry people in groups to different areas of Damascus. So an hour later, this would have been packed with families and with students. So, I mean, this is horrific. And as I said to you before we started, this attack comes at a point where the Syrian people are really starting to recover and really starting to feel that the terrorist threat is over. And as a friend of mine said to me today, she said, now we realize that the terrorist cells are among us, and it makes us feel we can't trust anyone. And of course, this is deliberate. The timing is deliberate.
It seems like it's because of all the normalization that's taking place. Is that how you interpret it as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it's British special forces in the south of Syria that have been training the armed groups in the use of IED. We know this. There's various reports on this and various admissions from the Ministry of Defence in the UK. But in March 2020, an SAS operative was flown from southern Syria to Jordan after he'd been injured in an IED attack, presumably as he was either training or helping the armed groups to lay the IEDs. And at the same time, of course, Israel fairly recently, I can't remember the exact date, it targeted Iranian and Hezbollah military, again, east of Palmyra, and it killed quite a large number with a missile launch from Tanef, as I said. So now we've had retaliation against that. 3 drones from Iraq and 2 from Syria targeted Tanef yesterday, causing some damage. Of course, the US is playing it down. There were no casualties. There was no damage. Reports from Syria kind of counter that. So I guess if you take something in the middle. But this is a precedent. This is the first time that the Allied Command Center has actually agreed on retaliation against the US, against Tanaf base. So there's a number of things that are going on at the moment that suggest there is a sort of an escalation in the actual direct confrontation between Israel and Iran. If Israel is now of course, it's always used the Iranian presence and the Hezbollah presence in Syria as an excuse for targeting Syrian air bases, Syrian installations, right? But now it appears to me more transparent that Israel is deliberately targeting Iranian military, Hezbollah military that are fighting ISIS, that is being implanted in that area by the US coalition. The interesting thing was, since the brokering of the Dara peace deal, we actually had a very quiet time from an Israeli perspective. Prior to that, we'd had a number of Israeli attacks. Of course, they always coincide with the liberation of areas from the armed groups. And as we know, Israel has supported the armed groups not only with hospital treatment, medical treatment, but also, as admitted by the Israeli Ministry of Defense, they have provided arms and weapons to the armed groups, the militia in Syria, to bring down the Syrian government. So we had a sort of we had a lull. And this, I believe, also was partly due to the fact that with the kind of Russian withdrawal from the Dara situation, this opened the door to Iranian troops and Hezbollah to go back to the border with Israel, because, of course, part of the 2018 peace deal brokered by Russia was that they would agree for Israel's benefit to withdraw Hezbollah and Iran to a safe area, let's say, where they weren't threatening Israel. And then more recently, in the last 2 weeks, we've had 2 attacks by Israel against Iranian military and Hezbollah that are fighting ISIS or trying to cleanse the eastern desert of the ISIS cells. And that, of course, then led to the retaliation by the resistance allies from Iraq and Syria against the Tanaf base, which is being used as the launch pad now.
Okay, and so Israel is definitely playing a major role, obviously, within Syria, and it has been for a very long time. In many cases, I would say Israel attacks Syria with airstrikes and drones, with drones mostly, several times a year. And I think a lot of people are wondering, and I've heard people make this argument or make this comment, why doesn't Syria respond? How do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, I think the other thing that people often say is, why aren't they using the S-300s? Look, the fact is that the Syrian air defense, whatever it is, whether it's S-200s, S-300s, S-400s, it doesn't matter. The Syrian air defense, and trust me, when you're here in Damascus and you hear the whoosh of the missile coming over, I tell you, you want to go and kiss every single air defense that is bringing these missiles down, because they are probably around 98% successful.
Okay.
Right. So whatever they have, it's successful. And
these are missile defense systems that prevent the Israeli missiles from actually hitting anything.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. And therefore, yes, they are fairly rudimentary, but just a nice little anecdote. Syrian engineers and particularly students spend their free time basically maintaining these air defense systems and improving them. This is Syria, it's one of the most resourceful countries in the Middle East. It's quite extraordinary from that perspective. So the air defense systems are very effective, one. Two, a lot of people don't know that Russia, to a large degree, believes that Syria should be the one defending Syrian territory under international law. But Russia has, for example, buzzed American planes. It's buzzed Israeli planes if they come too close, meaning, it will fly its planes close to the Russian the Israeli or the American planes to push them away, right? So it does intervene, but it's not publicized. It's not really talked about because this is military interaction, right? And so why Syria doesn't retaliate? Well, it just has retaliated against Tanaf. But Syria is fighting a war on multiple fronts.
Right.
Its borders are effectively occupied almost in every direction, apart from Lebanon, right? It can't afford to open up a new front with really a superior enemy in the sense of air force, military equipment, etc. I mean, Israel is power multiplied by the US coalition. It has nuclear arms, right? It has nuclear capability. So Syria has to be prudent in this. It has to play the long game. It has to defend itself, but it can't right now retaliate because this would open up an entire new front that I don't think it's really prepared to do. Exactly. Plus, then that would create sort of it would escalate tensions between the US and Russia. Effectively, this would precipitate a world war.
And I think, but it sounds like, I mean, that's exactly what Israel wants, right? In terms of, trying to pull in Iran and Syria and Hezbollah into these conflicts that it's actively arming and destabilizing, to Israel that benefits Israel, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So Vanessa, I really appreciate you joining me today to, kind of give us a war update on what's taking place in Syria. I think there's some, positive things, looking at normalization with Syria. Syria's, Damascus airport opening up for business and other countries opening up travel to Syria. However, there's obviously a lot, going on with this recent bus bombing in Damascus and these vacuums that are being filled with possibly more, armed groups or jihadists, whatever they are. So I really appreciate you coming on today and explaining this to us. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Manar. Thanks for having me on.